James Turner never expected that a single moment, a moment so ordinary that it barely made a dent in his memory, would be the one to change everything. It was a Tuesday evening, an evening like any other in the small town of Griffin's Hollow. The streets were quiet, the air crisp with the remnants of the fading autumn chill. James had just finished his shift at the local auto repair shop, where he'd worked for the past 15 years. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and he was proud of what he did. His hands, calloused and worn from years of labor, were a testament to his life, a life that had always been routine, predictable, and simple. He had his small circle of friends, a modest home, and a quiet sense of contentment. He was in his late 30s, not a man of great ambition but a man who was grateful for the stability he'd built. That evening, after locking up the shop, he headed out in his aging truck for the short drive home. The town, with its picturesque downtown square and charming, if slightly worn, houses, seemed frozen in time. The lights of the local diner flickered as James passed by, offering a soft glow against the fading twilight. It was peaceful, the kind of place where you could walk down the street at night without a second thought. There were no dangers lurking here, no hidden secrets or dark undertones. Or so James thought. As he turned onto Oak Street, a familiar sight caught his eye, a police cruiser, parked at the curb, its lights dimmed, though the vehicle was clearly still running. For a moment, James felt a small knot form in his stomach. He was no stranger to the occasional traffic stop, but the officers around Griffin's Hollow had always been polite, professional. Nothing ever felt off. That sense of security, however, was about to shatter in an instant. The cruiser's headlights flicked on, cutting through the night as James continued his slow drive home. He wasn't speeding, didn't feel like he was doing anything out of the ordinary, but he'd learned over the years that you never really knew when the rules might suddenly change. The cruiser's siren went off, brief, sharp, and demanding. "Great," James muttered under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. His truck's engine sputtered to a stop, the rumble dying down as he shifted the gear into park. He glanced into the rearview mirror. The officer who stepped out of the cruiser was Officer Grant, a man James had known for years. Grant had been around the town longer than most people, having grown up just down the street. A few times, they'd shared brief conversations about the old days. James had always found him decent, maybe a little too serious at times, but he'd never had reason to doubt his professionalism. "Evening, Turner," Officer Grant said, his voice flat as he approached the window. His tone was distant, colder than James had expected. Something was off, but James couldn't place it. He rolled down the window. "Evening, Grant. What's the problem?" James asked, trying to keep things light. He had no reason to believe there was anything wrong, but there was an uneasy feeling creeping into his chest. "License and registration," Grant said, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was no small talk, no friendly banter. He didn't even look at James directly as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the paperwork. James hesitated for a moment, but then quickly reached for his glove box, pulling out his papers. He handed them over without saying another word, feeling a strange unease spreading through him. Grant took the documents and began to look them over, his eyes scanning them with an intensity that felt almost mechanical. "Everything in order?" James asked, hoping to break the ice. But the question was met with silence. Officer Grant didn't respond at first. Instead, he slowly looked up from the documents and into James' eyes. "Step out of the vehicle," Grant said, his voice still even, but now tinged with an edge that James couldn't quite place. James froze for a moment. "What's going on, Grant? Is everything okay?" "You need to step out of the vehicle. Now." A chill ran down James' spine. This was not how things were supposed to go. The officer he knew wasn't like this, he wasn't confrontational, especially not over something as trivial as a simple traffic stop. But there was something in Grant's eyes now, a strange and unreadable expression that made James uneasy. Against his better judgment, he opened the door and stepped out of the truck. "What's this about?" James asked again, his voice a little firmer now, but still trying to maintain calm. Without saying another word, Grant waved his hand, signaling another officer who had just appeared from around the corner of the cruiser. This officer, one James didn't recognize, moved toward him with an air of authority that felt oppressive. "Do you have anything on you, Mr. Turner?" the second officer asked, his voice flat and uninviting. "Excuse me?" James asked, confused. "What's going on here?" "I'm just heading home." The officer didn't respond directly but motioned for Grant to begin a search. James felt a tightening in his chest. He wasn't doing anything wrong, so why was this happening? The first officer began to pat him down, checking his pockets in an almost mechanical fashion. James couldn't help but feel humiliated. He was a grown man, a hard-working mechanic, and he didn't deserve to be treated like this. "Grant, what is this?" James' voice was rising now, frustration spilling into his words. He didn't want to make a scene, but this wasn't right. Grant didn't answer. Instead, the second officer, a man in his late 20s with sharp features and dark hair, quickly moved to James' truck. Within seconds, he pulled out a small bag from under the seat, something that looked suspiciously like drugs. "What's this?" the officer demanded, holding the bag up for James to see. James' heart dropped. "I don't know what that is," James said, his voice rising with panic. "I didn't put that there." Grant didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back, his face unreadable. The second officer walked around to the front of the truck, and James could hear him on the radio. "We've got a full bust here. Got the suspect in custody." James could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. Something far more sinister was unfolding. "You're under arrest for possession and distribution," Grant finally said, his tone cold and distant. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." James stood there, stunned. His entire world had just flipped upside down. He hadn't touched that bag. He hadn't even seen it before. But there it was, being used against him. As the officers handcuffed him and led him to the back of the cruiser, James couldn't help but feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was he being targeted? Why now? And who would believe him when the evidence was right there? This wasn't just a bad night. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would take James down a path he never could have imagined. A path that would change everything. A path that would unravel the truth in a way no one expected, and in the process, reveal a much darker conspiracy lurking beneath the surface of the small town he'd always known as home. As the police cruiser pulled away, James turned his head slightly to look back at his truck, still parked on the side of the road. His life, in that one moment, had been taken from him. What happened next would be the last thing anyone expected. The days that followed James' arrest felt like an endless blur. He sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, the harsh lights above casting long, distorted shadows against the concrete walls. His mind was racing, still unable to comprehend what had just happened. How had his normal, uneventful life turned into this nightmare in the span of a few minutes? The drugs found under his seat, a small bag, as the officers had claimed, were completely foreign to him. He had no idea how it had gotten there. All he could think about was that strange look in Officer Grant's eyes and the urgency with which they'd taken him away. Something was wrong. Something didn't add up, and James knew it, but in the confines of that small jail cell, he had no way of proving it. The town was abuzz with news of his arrest. James had been a familiar figure in Griffin's Hollow for years. His shop was a landmark, and he had a reputation as a hard-working, straightforward man. But now, the gossip spreading through the streets painted him as a criminal. A drug dealer. The whispers at the diner, the hushed conversations in the corners of bars, everyone had an opinion. A few friends stopped by the station, but their words of comfort seemed hollow, their eyes filled with doubt. After all, the evidence was clear, wasn't it? There was a bag of drugs found in his truck. He'd been arrested. His fate seemed sealed. James tried to stay calm as he waited for his lawyer to arrive, but it was difficult. His mind kept looping back to the same question: why? Why would they do this to him? Why would Officer Grant, a man he had known for years, suddenly turn against him like this? It didn't make sense. His past interactions with the police had always been cordial, even friendly at times. The arrest felt personal, and that only deepened the confusion. If this was just a routine bust, why was everything moving so quickly? Why wasn't he allowed to make a phone call? Why hadn't they asked for a drug test or any kind of verification? The more James thought about it, the more unsettling the whole situation became. Finally, after hours of silence, his lawyer, Rachel Simmons, arrived. A young woman with dark hair and an intense focus, Rachel was known in Griffin's Hollow for being a fierce defender of her clients. She was fresh out of law school, but her reputation was quickly growing. She entered the room with a determined look on her face, her eyes scanning James' disheveled appearance. He hadn't shaved or showered since his arrest. He felt like a shell of himself, exhausted and desperate for answers. "James," Rachel said, sitting across from him, her voice steady and calm. "I've been looking into the case. This is a mess. There's a lot here that doesn't add up." Bad situation, this was a setup, and he was the pawn in someone else's game. The next morning, as the sun slowly rose over Griffin's Hollow, James was led into the courthouse for his arraignment. The small town's courthouse was nothing special, an old, two-story building with peeling paint and faded wooden floors. The air inside felt heavy, as if it had absorbed the stories of countless past trials and heartbreaks. James wasn't prepared for what he was about to face. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of whom had no doubt already made up their minds about his guilt. His reputation as a simple mechanic had crumbled in the wake of the arrest, and now he was just another criminal in the eyes of the town. As James stood in the dock, facing the judge, he felt like a man on trial, not just for a crime he didn't commit, but for a life that was about to be ripped apart. He didn't know how to plead his innocence. He didn't know who to trust. The charges against him were serious: drug possession, intent to distribute, but none of it made sense. He had never touched the drugs found in his truck. But the evidence was stacked against him. How could he fight back when everything seemed so stacked in the police's favor? The prosecutor, a man named Michael Harper, stood up with a smug expression on his face. He was well known in town for being tough on crime, and he relished the opportunity to bring down someone like James. "Your Honor, we have the defendant in custody, and we have the evidence to support the charges against him," Harper said, his voice oozing confidence. "The drugs were found in his vehicle, and he has no reasonable explanation for their presence. This is a clear case of possession with intent to distribute." James felt the weight of those words crashing down on him. He wanted to speak, to protest, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, and his heart was racing. The world around him seemed to spin. Just as the prosecutor continued, something unexpected happened. Rachel, his lawyer, stood up sharply. "Your Honor, I request a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding my client's arrest. We have reason to believe that the evidence was planted, and that the officers involved may not be acting in good faith." The courtroom fell silent. James glanced at Rachel, his heart swelling with a faint hope. At least someone was willing to fight for him. The judge, an older man with a stern expression, nodded slowly. "Very well, I will allow the investigation to proceed. But Mr. Turner will remain in custody until further hearings." As the session came to an end, James was escorted back to his cell, but the smallest glimmer of hope had taken root. The investigation wasn't over. The truth had not been buried yet. He wasn't going to give up without a fight, not now. Not when he knew, deep down, that someone was behind this. Someone powerful. The days after James' arraignment felt like an eternity. His life was now a series of cold, impersonal walls, the grim holding cell, the courtroom with its harsh lights, the unfeeling bureaucracy of the legal system. Griffin's Hollow, once a peaceful town where everyone knew each other's name, now felt like a strange and hostile place. People who had once been friendly waved at him from a distance, but their smiles were tight, their eyes full of doubt. Whispers followed him wherever he went, and though no one outright accused him, the air was thick with suspicion. The shock of his arrest hadn't worn off, and the town had split into two factions, those who believed in his innocence and those who saw him as guilty. Even the shop he had worked at for years had been abandoned by most of its regular customers. He was no longer the trusted mechanic, he was a suspect, a criminal. But James refused to wallow in despair. He couldn't afford to. Every day he spent locked away was another day closer to the truth. Rachel, his lawyer, had worked tirelessly on his case, digging through records, questioning witnesses, and reviewing every scrap of evidence. Slowly, a plan was forming. She was convinced there was more to this than just a botched arrest. She suspected that James was part of a much larger scheme, one that had been set in motion long before the drugs had appeared in his truck. But who was behind it? And why had they chosen him as the target? That was the question that gnawed at her every night. In the days leading up to his next hearing, Rachel uncovered a few shocking leads. The most disturbing of these was tied to Officer Grant, the man who had arrested James. It turned out that Grant had been involved in several questionable activities in the past, some of which had gone under the radar due to his seniority within the department. Rachel found evidence of corruption in Grant's past, including ties to organized crime syndicates operating just beyond the town's borders. The discovery didn't make sense. Why would someone like Grant, a man who had served the town for years, suddenly go rogue? And why would he frame an ordinary man like James, and he was going to find out who? One of Rachel's leads had also uncovered a disturbing connection between a local drug ring and a powerful group in the city. It seemed that there was a flow of narcotics through Griffin's Hollow, and while most people were blissfully unaware, the town had become a strategic point in a much larger operation. The more Rachel delved into the investigation, the more she realized that James' arrest had been no accident. He wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time, he had been chosen. But why? Was it simply because of his proximity to the case, or was he being used as a pawn in something far bigger? Rachel met with James in the holding cell one evening, her face more serious than ever. When she sat down in front of him, her eyes locked onto his with a certain intensity. "James, I've uncovered something. Something that may explain why you were arrested, but it's going to be dangerous. You need to be prepared for what's coming." James leaned forward, his heart hammering in his chest. "What is it? What's going on?" Rachel hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I found out about Officer Grant. He's been working with a group that's been funneling drugs through Griffin's Hollow. They've been using the local police force as their cover for years. But here's the kicker, Grant isn't just a small player in this. He's been involved with the FBI. The real question is, why would a guy like Grant, someone with connections, do something like this? I think you were set up as part of a much larger scheme. This drug bust, it wasn't supposed to happen the way it did." James sat back in shock, his mind struggling to process the words. His gut had been telling him something wasn't right about the situation, but this was on another level entirely. The thought that Officer Grant could have been involved with the FBI, using his position to cover up a drug operation, was enough to make anyone's stomach churn. And to think that James had been dragged into this mess without even realizing it, it was almost too much to bear. Are you saying that Grant planted the drugs on me? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel nodded gravely. I don't have concrete proof yet, but I'm willing to bet he did. The evidence is too convenient, too clean. It's almost as if someone had a hand in making sure you were caught. And I think you were just a stepping stone. Whoever is behind this wanted to make an example out of you, to send a message that no one could get in their way. The weight of her words hung in the air. James felt a knot in his stomach. He wasn't just fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was tangled up in something much more dangerous, and he had no idea how deep the conspiracy ran. Over the next few days, things began to escalate. The investigation into Officer Grant's past took on a new urgency as Rachel dug deeper. She found that Grant had a series of encrypted phone records, some of which contained coded messages. But they weren't just random communications, they were linked to a man named Hector Vargas, a known drug lord operating out of the nearby city. Vargas had a reputation for being ruthless, and his network stretched far beyond Griffin's Hollow. Rachel also discovered that Grant had been spotted meeting with Vargas on several occasions, always in secret. The two men had an arrangement, a deal that seemed to benefit both sides. And James? He was nothing more than an innocent bystander in their larger game. But the deeper Rachel dug, the more dangerous the situation became. One evening, as she was leaving her office after a long day of reviewing documents, she was approached by someone she didn't expect, a man in a dark suit with a sharp, calculating look in his eyes. He stepped up to her quietly, without a word, and handed her a file. Careful with this, the man said in a low voice before walking away. Rachel opened the file, and inside were photos of her and James, taken recently, while she'd been investigating. The images were taken in places she'd visited, at times she'd been alone. The man had been watching her. Watching them both. Rachel knew then that they were getting too close. Someone didn't want the truth to come out, and they were willing to stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The note in the file was clear: back off, or the consequences would be dire. But Rachel was no stranger to danger. She wasn't going to stop now, not when she was so close. She knew that if she was going to help James, she would have to take risks. She would have to go beyond the law and do whatever it took to expose the conspiracy that was slowly poisoning their town. She called James that evening to brief him on what she'd found. "James, things are getting more complicated," she said, her voice tense. "We're up against something big. This isn't just about you anymore. There are people involved who will stop at nothing to protect their operation. But I'm not backing down. I'm not leaving you to face this alone." James felt a surge of gratitude. Rachel wasn't just his lawyer, she had become his ally, his protector in a world that seemed bent on tearing him apart. He couldn't let her face this alone. But as he prepared for what was to come, he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer just fighting for his freedom. He knew that the clock was ticking. The people behind this conspiracy wouldn't wait forever. They would come for him, and they would come for Rachel. And when they did, everything would change. The town of Griffin's Hollow would never be. James stood in the dimly lit room of his attorney's office, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. Each document contained names, dates, and details that painted a picture he wasn't ready to face. It felt as though his entire world had been turned upside down, and yet, Rachel had made it clear that they had to move forward. There was no turning back now. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the corruption in Griffin's Hollow went far deeper than either of them had initially realized. What started as a simple case of mistaken identity had morphed into a far-reaching conspiracy involving some of the most powerful people in the region. Rachel had stayed late into the night, piecing together the fragments of the case, connecting dots that seemed scattered and random at first but were starting to take shape. Each discovery felt like a stone being turned, revealing something darker and more unsettling beneath the surface. She had found a trail of encrypted phone calls, a money laundering scheme that ran through the small businesses in the town, and evidence that suggested Officer Grant had been part of a covert operation to protect and shield Hector Vargas, the notorious drug lord. As the days passed, Rachel became more certain that Grant had not acted alone in framing James. There were others involved, people who had the resources and connections to make things happen without a second thought. It was a scheme that had been built over years, a web of deceit that intertwined local law enforcement with criminals at the highest levels. And now, James had been dragged into it as a pawn. The phone rang, breaking James from his reverie. He glanced at Rachel, who gave him a reassuring smile before picking it up. She listened intently, her eyes narrowing as she processed the information. James watched her, waiting for her to speak. "I've got it," Rachel finally said, setting the phone down slowly. "We have confirmation. Officer Grant has been moving money for Vargas, laundering it through the local businesses. It's all connected. And you, James, were just an unfortunate bystander in their game." James felt a shiver run down his spine. His mind raced as he tried to understand the implications of Rachel's words. The town had always been small, quiet, peaceful, but now it felt like an intricate stage for a criminal enterprise, one that reached into every corner of his life. How had he been so blind to it all? And more importantly, why him? What had made him the target of this conspiracy? Rachel continued, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "We're going to need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets. We need to expose Grant and the rest of them before they can silence us." She paused, her gaze fixing on James. "I'm going to bring in a few people," he said again. The town officials, the businesses, they had all been complicit in some way, whether out of ignorance or fear, in allowing this criminal network to flourish. James' arrest had been a turning point. It had been the catalyst that forced the truth to come out into the open. But even as the town reeled from the revelation, the danger to James and Rachel only intensified. The forces behind the conspiracy were not going to sit idly by while their empire crumbled. James began receiving anonymous threats, notes left on his car, phone calls in the dead of night. Each message grew more sinister, more threatening. They knew where he lived, where he worked, and they made it clear that he wouldn't be safe for long if he didn't drop the case. But James was not afraid. The town had already turned its back on him, and he had nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, Officer Grant was nowhere to be found. After the investigation into his ties to Vargas and the money laundering scheme went public, he disappeared without a trace. Rumors swirled that he had fled the country, but no one knew for sure. What was certain was that his involvement in the conspiracy had cost him his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. As Rachel and Elijah continued to push for justice, they found themselves facing even greater opposition. The higher-ups in law enforcement, the local officials who had been complicit in the operation, were doing everything they could to suppress the investigation. They used their power to intimidate witnesses, silence whistleblowers, and obstruct justice at every turn. It was clear that this wasn't just a local problem anymore, it was part of a larger system of corruption that reached all the way to the top. But Rachel refused to back down. She had come too far, and she had made a promise to James that she would fight for him until the end. As the weeks dragged on, their efforts began to pay off. More witnesses came forward, more evidence was uncovered, and the pressure on those involved in the conspiracy continued to mount. Finally, after months of tireless work, they were ready to make their move. The pieces of the puzzle were in place. They had enough evidence to bring down the entire operation, to expose the corruption that had infected Griffin's Hollow, and to clear James' name once and for all. The day of reckoning arrived, and it was unlike anything James had ever imagined. The courthouse was packed, the air thick with anticipation. People had come from all over the town, some hopeful that the truth would finally come to light, others unsure of what to believe. James stood at the center of it all, a man who had lost everything but was finally prepared to take back what was rightfully his. Rachel stood beside him, her eyes fierce with determination. She had fought for this moment, and now it was time to deliver the final blow. As the proceedings began, Rachel presented the evidence, the financial records, the testimonies, the covert recordings that had been obtained by Elijah's team. Each piece painted a damning portrait of the conspiracy that had rotted the very foundation of their town. The courtroom was in shock, unable to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. And then, the unexpected happened. As the trial reached its climax, just when it seemed as though justice was finally within reach, someone else stepped forward, a figure cloaked in mystery, a man whose very presence seemed to shift the air in the room. It was a man who had been quietly pulling strings from the shadows all along. The real mastermind behind the entire operation, the one who had the courtroom fell into a stunned silence when the man stepped forward, his presence alone enough to halt the proceedings. James felt his heart race in his chest as he looked up at the stranger, tall, composed, and dressed impeccably in a dark suit. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room like a predator assessing its surroundings. There was an aura about him, one that screamed power and influence. It was as if he had stepped out of the shadows of Griffin's Hollow's darkest secrets. Rachel's hand tightened on the file she was holding, and she exchanged a brief, startled glance with Elijah. Neither of them had seen this man before, but they both instinctively understood that this was no ordinary witness or lawyer. This was the person who had been behind the strings of the conspiracy all along. James, still recovering from the shock, watched as the man made his way to the front of the courtroom, his movements smooth and deliberate. "Your Honor," the man began, his voice deep and calm, commanding attention with every syllable. "I think it's time for the truth to come out. It's a pity that things have to be dragged out like this, but it's also necessary." The judge, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing uncertainty, nodded hesitantly. "Who are you?" he asked, clearly unsettled by the interruption. "I am someone who's been watching this case very closely. I represent the interests of many who have yet to reveal themselves," the man replied, his gaze never wavering. "I'm afraid I have information that will change everything. You see, this isn't just about James Williams, or Officer Grant, or even Hector Vargas. No, this is much bigger." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. James tried to make sense of what was happening, but his mind raced, caught between disbelief and fear. Who was this man, and how did he know everything? What did he mean by bigger? He turned to Rachel, but she looked just as confused, her brow furrowed in concentration as she analyzed the new development. She had expected resistance, but this felt different. This felt like the kind of move that could derail everything they had worked for. "I have connections to the people who have been controlling Griffin's Hollow for years," the man continued, his gaze shifting toward the prosecutor and the defense table, where James Saturday, the drug ring, the corruption in law enforcement, the cover-ups, you've all been following the wrong trail. This whole thing, it's all part of a much larger operation. But I'm afraid that's just the tip of the iceberg. The man paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room. Everyone in the courtroom, from the jury to the onlookers, was riveted by his sudden, authoritative presence. There was a collective intake of breath as the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Rachel stood up, her eyes narrowing as she addressed the man. "Who are you really?" she demanded. "What's your game here?" The man smirked, clearly unfazed by her challenge. "I'm someone who's been forced to clean up a mess you all can't even begin to understand. You've been chasing ghosts while the real mastermind has been pulling the strings from the shadows." James' mind raced, trying to make sense of this unexpected twist. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice hoarse with frustration. "Why are you doing this? Why now?" The man's smile was cold, but there was a glint in his eyes that spoke volumes. "What I want is simple," he replied. "I want control. This town, this entire operation, none of this was ever meant to be exposed. It's too late now, of course, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that this is bigger than any of you. It's bigger than me, too. But if you want answers, you'll have to play by my rules. James got twisted. His life had already been turned upside down by this conspiracy, but now it seemed as if the world around him was collapsing even further. This man, whoever he was, held all the cards. And unless they played his game, everything they had worked for, all the progress they'd made, would be for nothing. Enough games, Rachel said, her voice filled with resolve. If you think you can intimidate us, you're wrong. We've come too far, and we won't stop until the truth is out. If you're involved in this, then it's time you took responsibility. The man's eyes flickered with amusement, and he stepped closer to the front of the courtroom. You think you've uncovered the truth? He asked, his voice laced with mockery. The truth is far more complicated than you realize, Ms. Jensen. You're on the brink of something you don't understand. You've only scratched the surface. Rachel's face hardened. I understand enough to know you're part of the problem. And we're going to expose you, just like we've exposed Grant and Vargas. But the man wasn't fazed. Instead, he pulled out a sleek black briefcase from beneath the table and set it down with a deliberate motion. Slowly, he opened it to reveal several files, each one stamped with official-looking markings. As he slid the top file out, he placed it on the table in front of the judge. This, he said, is the beginning of the end for you, Ms. Jensen, and for anyone else who dares to take down the people who really run things around here. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the contents of the file were exposed. James could see photographs, names, and more, things he couldn't yet process fully. But one thing was clear, this was a threat on a much larger scale than they had imagined. Rachel grabbed the file, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. As she skimmed over the details, her eyes widened in disbelief. This isn't possible, she muttered under her breath. What's in there? James asked, his voice strained. Rachel's eyes locked with his, her expression grim. This is worse than I thought. This is an organized network, one that has been infiltrating the highest levels of government, law enforcement, and business for years. The people behind this have influence far beyond this town. They have connections in places that would make your head spin. James felt the weight of the situation crashing down on him. Everything he thought he knew about the case, about the fight for justice, was now in jeopardy. The conspiracy wasn't just local, it was part of something far larger, and these people had no intention of letting anyone expose them. This wasn't just about saving James anymore, it was about taking down a network of corruption that reached into every corner of society. The man standing before them had a cold, calculating smile. You're out of your depth, Ms. Jensen. You can keep trying, but in the end, you'll see that this is a game you cannot win. The real players are always one step ahead. This is my final warning, walk away now, and maybe you'll live to see another day. Rachel stood firm, her jaw clenched. You can threaten all you want, but we're not backing down. You'll see that. The man nodded slowly, his smile widening. We'll see. But remember, you were warned. As he turned and walked out of the courtroom, the tension that had gripped the room lingered. The air was thick with uncertainty, and James could feel the gravity of the situation bearing down on him. They weren't just fighting for his freedom anymore. They were fighting against a machine that was determined to stay hidden, a machine that would do anything to protect its power. The stakes had never been higher. The courtroom remained in a tense hush long after the man had left. James could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the air thick with uncertainty and fear. Every person in that room understood that the game had changed, and no one knew where it was going next. Rachel stood at the center of it all, her face a mix of determination and disbelief. Elijah, too, had grown quiet, the wheels turning in his mind as he processed the revelation. They were no longer just trying to clear James' name. They were up against a shadowy network that could move mountains to protect its interests. And they were trapped in a game far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Rachel's mind was racing. The documents they had uncovered had already linked Officer Grant to Hector Vargas, but the new file from the mysterious man had expanded everything into a nightmare. The conspiracy wasn't just about a few corrupt cops. It was a web of corruption that spread like an invisible network, with tentacles reaching into high-level political circles, law enforcement, and corporate interests. Whoever this man was, he had just thrown them into a much larger arena, one with rules they didn't understand and an enemy far more powerful than they had anticipated. "That's it then," Elijah said, breaking the silence as he folded his arms. His voice was grim but resolute. "They've got everything locked down. They won't stop until they've buried us all." Rachel didn't reply right away. She was trying to absorb the enormity of what they were dealing with. The names and faces they had been chasing, the pieces of the puzzle they'd collected, none of it mattered now. The truth they'd been pursuing was far more complicated, far darker. The people behind this conspiracy weren't just criminals. They were master manipulators, playing a game that few could ever hope to understand, let alone survive. The stakes had risen, and the cost of failure was no longer just James' life, it was the very fabric of the justice system itself. "We can't back down now," Rachel finally said, her voice steady. "We've come too far. We can't let them get away with this." James looked at her, his own resolve building, despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "You're right," he said, though the weight of what he was agreeing to made him pause. The world around them had shifted. What started as a case of mistaken identity had now evolved into a battle against a deeply entrenched, highly organized system of corruption. But James was no longer the man who had walked into the courtroom months ago, confused and powerless. The truth had already cost him everything, his career, his reputation, his life. But he wasn't going to let these faceless enemies destroy him without a fight. Not after everything he had learned, not after everything they had uncovered together. Rachel turned to him, her eyes sharp. "We need to take this to the next level. We need to get the information out there. Every name, every connection, every single piece of evidence. It's the only way we can start peeling this back. If we go public, they won't be able to control the narrative anymore." James nodded, his pulse quickening. The public was their only hope. If they could expose the truth in the open, they might be able to tear down the walls the conspiracy had built. But that wasn't going to be easy. The people behind this weren't just corrupt officers or local businessmen. They were powerful figures who had mastered the art of pulling strings from behind the scenes. Going public meant opening a floodgate of retaliation, a war that could cost them everything. Elijah stepped forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "You're right. We need to release this, but we have to be strategic. We can't just throw everything out there and hope it sticks. We need allies, people in the media, people with influence who can help amplify this. If we don't, they'll crush us before we even get started." Rachel agreed, her eyes scanning the room as if already planning their next move. "We'll need to go to the press, but we have to make sure they can't shut us down. We'll need a whistleblower from inside, someone who knows more than they're willing to say. And we need to tie all the pieces together. This isn't just about a drug lord. This is about a network, a system that's been built up over decades. We need to expose it all, every part of it." James felt the urgency in her voice, and it sparked something deep within him. He had already sacrificed so much, but if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was that he couldn't walk away now. The conspiracy that had framed him was only a small part of a much larger, much more dangerous game. And if he was going to survive this, he would have to go all in. But even as they began to strategize their next steps, James knew there was one critical thing they hadn't prepared for: the people behind this were watching them. They were waiting for them to make a move, waiting for them to slip up. The threats had already started, and they were going to get worse. Rachel had already made it clear that they were playing with fire, but now it felt as though the flames were closing in around them. Rachel's phone buzzed, interrupting the tense silence that had fallen over the room. She glanced down at the screen, her expression unreadable. She swiped to answer. "What is it?" Elijah asked, his voice low. Rachel didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were scanning something on her phone. After a moment, she looked up, her face pale. "They know we're moving forward. They've already leaked information to the press. Someone's making sure the story gets twisted." James' stomach sank. They had been careful, too careful to make sure that no one would know what they were doing until they were ready. But somehow, someone had gotten to the press, and now their carefully laid plans were in jeopardy. "We need to move faster," Rachel said, her voice sharp. "This isn't just about Grant or Vargas anymore. If they're already leaking this information, it means they have people everywhere. It's not just the local law enforcement we're up against. They've infiltrated the media, the government, everywhere." Elijah nodded grimly. "So what's the plan?" "We have to go on the offensive. They're going to try to discredit everything we do." James stood up, his mind made up. "I don't care if they discredit us. We have the truth on our side. We have to take this public, and we have to take it all the way. No more games. No more hiding." Rachel and Elijah exchanged a look, then nodded. There was no turning back now. The truth had already started to leak out, and if they didn't act quickly, the whole operation could collapse before they had the chance to expose it. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. Rachel worked tirelessly to organize a network of allies, journalists, investigators, anyone who could help them amplify the story and ensure that it would reach the right people. Meanwhile, Elijah used his connections to dig deeper into the players behind the scenes, uncovering more links to high-level corruption and cover-ups. The evidence was overwhelming, but the more they uncovered, the more dangerous things became. It wasn't long before the media began to catch wind of the story, and what had been a quiet local scandal exploded into national headlines. News outlets were abuzz with speculation about the deep ties between law enforcement, organized crime, and the political elite. But with the media attention came increased scrutiny, and the shadowy figures behind the conspiracy began to fight back. Threats escalated, and James could feel the walls closing in as the stakes grew higher with each passing hour. In a final act of defiance, James stood before the courthouse once more, this time with a microphone in hand, flanked by Rachel and Elijah. The press had gathered, the cameras rolling, the nation watching. The truth, everything they had uncovered, was about to be revealed. But in that moment, James knew that no matter the outcome, the fight had changed him forever. They had brought the darkness into the light, but the battle for justice was far from over. They were not done. The final showdown was just beginning.